okay? And Central America right now is in the news, but for all the wrong reasons. There's so much rhetoric going on with politics about caravans of migrants, the dangers of the Maras Salvatruchas, the MS-13, and how Central America is posing a threat to even our national security. And let me say this, I would like to say this, that throughout history, it is hard to find a more victimized group than the people from Central America. The politics of fear have re-victimized these people, and being someone close to the situation, spending a lot of time in El Salvador, Honduras, a little time in Guatemala, I feel that this is a real disgrace. And when I see the xenophobia, I see children in cages, families separated, okay? I see these things going on, and I feel ashamed when I talk to my friends from Central America, and I'm with my family down in Mexico. Central America has always resided in the shadows. Even at first, Central America was part of Mexico and didn't gain its independence until 1823. And from 1823 to 1840, it was part of the Confederation of Central American States, which included Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. And the war between the liberals and the conservatives actually ruptured that union, and that's how you have the individual states that were formed. War, Central America is a history of war, disease, oppressive rule by the military, corruption, the authoritarian nature at least in the 19th century of the Catholic Church, and all these problems carried over to the 20th century. The State Department would joke in El Salvador that once someone was stationed in El Salvador as an ambassador working for the State Department, you could read the history of El Salvador in 45 minutes. They said there was not much interest in Central America or its history. The history kind of encountered a little bit of a revitalization in 1992 for the celebration of the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus coming to the Americas. And also, it was in the news for all the wrong reasons, like it is in the news now, because it was an area strife with civil war and atrocity, especially atrocity related to the time coinciding with the Cold War. Central America gained importance as a geopolitical strategic point with the construction of the Panama Canal. And then, like, for example, Nicaragua in the 20th century, in 1909, the U.S. mobilized right-wing forces to take down the government of Jose Santos Zelaya. This led to an occupation of Nicaragua by U.S. forces that lasted until the 1930s. So we were there from 1909 to the 1930s, occupying Nicaragua as a strategic point to protect the Panama Canal, or the construction of the Panama Canal. The idea before was to construct the canal from Nicaragua also, but that kind of fell through, so the location was changed. But the U.S. supported the National Guard. They supported anti-Sandino forces, and the Sandinistas, or the Sandino forces, loyal to Sandino, withdrew, and the U.S. helped the National Guard crush the Sandinistas and putting into power Somoza. Somoza was a dictator in Nicaragua, and he lasted until 1979. So it was the mid-30s to 1979 Somoza was in charge of Nicaragua. Among other things, Somoza robbed the country blind. Okay, he was a dictator, repressive, cruel, but among other things, he was a great thief. Right? His personal wealth by 1979, when the Sandinista revolution came, was $900 million. And So, but he left in 1979. Uprising. A popular uprising happened against the 14 families, the oligarchs in El Salvador, and a couple hundred people were killed by this rebellion. And the government came back with military forces and killed between 30,000 and 60,000 Salvadoranians. Okay? This is a large number, especially considering how small of a country El Salvador is. And they targeted, among other things, anyone that looked indigenous. So that's where I said it could have possibly been a genocide, because you're targeting a specific population, and you're targeting, even though El Salvador didn't have a very big indigenous population at the time, you're targeting this population that was indigenous. Right now in El Salvador, the indigenous population doesn't really exist. Now we get to the Cold War, okay, which is that was just a little background information, okay, background information to Central America, its strategic importance to the U.S., and some of the events that happened leading up to the Cold War. Okay, in 1951, Guatemala was under the leadership of Jacobo Arbenz, and he wanted to initiate a land distribution policy to help the struggling small farmers, including large portions of property owned by the United Fruit Company. Okay, United Fruit Company was a fruit company owned by the United States, and so when Arbenz wanted to nationalize or divide up this land, the United Fruit Company asked for an amount of money that the Arbenz government could not pay. And of course, they couldn't pay, so they didn't pay it. U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and the CIA Director Allen Dulles, who were both partners in United Fruit Washington and the United Fruit Washington law firm, persuaded President Eisenhower to remove Arbenz by force. Okay, so basically, it was a CIA coup, a CIA-led coup in Guatemala. Something that would replicate itself in places like Chile. Okay, so this was like probably the first CIA-led coup in all of Latin America. Okay, during the Cold War. This prompted, okay, the coming to power of the military of Guatemala under Castillo Armas. I'm glad my wife isn't here because I'm butchering the Spanish. Because mixed with English and Spanish, yeah. Okay, so the U.S. intervention was supposed to save Guatemala from communism, but it was only there to preserve financial interests, really. Regardless, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles declared Guatemala had been saved from communist imperialism, and it was a new and glorious chapter in the already great tradition of American states. That was a quote by Dulles. And what happened in Guatemala? In Guatemala since 1966, approximately 200,000 Guatemalans were murdered. Okay, 1966 to the mid-80s. Majority, ethnic Mayan. So this is where we talk about genocide. It's a specific group, okay, ethnic Mayan, indigenous population of Guatemala, targeted by the government, okay? And as I said, it could be technically be listed as a genocide under the definition from Raphael Lemkin and under the UN Genocide Convention, right? But much of the damage occurred in the early 1980s under the military regime of Rios Montt. Okay, Rios Montt was nothing more than a military leader, and Rios Montt received supplies. The U.S. supplied money, military equipment to Guatemala, and also logistical support. Okay, so we didn't really have boots on the ground in Guatemala, like for example El Salvador or Honduras, because the Guatemalans were very protective of their territory, but we supplied equipment, weapons, and money to the Montt government. Ronald Reagan, said of Montt that he was a great man of personal integrity and getting a bum rap on human rights. Before his death in 2018, Montt was tried in Guatemala for genocide and the killing of at least 1,171 members of the Mayan Ixtel community. Okay? So, of course, Mon killed more than that, his government killed more than that, but that was the only thing they could actually prove him. They had the hard evidence that he was responsible for that atrocity. Mon infamously said to the Guatemalan peasantry, to the peasants, if you are with us, we will feed you. If not, we will kill you. The trial against Mon on genocide was really an historic and important step within Guatemala. Okay, so I mean, just imagine, like, you know, the society that is still very divided. If you go to Guatemala, they don't talk about this. You don't hear anything about the Civil War. You ask questions. It's very closed about that time period in their history, right? El Salvador is more open, more receptive, because they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that did not exist in Guatemala. And when I say indigenous communities, if you go to parts of Mexico, Central America, especially Guatemala, there are so many indigenous communities. I was teaching in Hualtuco, Oaxaca, and a lot of my students were indigenous. In fact, Spanish was their second language. So I was teaching them international relations and English. And when we were in our English classes, they had to do a double translation. They had to do like, oh, wait, first in Spanish, then in English, right? So I think there's like over 45 languages, indigenous languages in Oaxaca. Maybe less now because I think there's a lot of assimilation going on. But in Guatemala, of all the Central American countries, they have the largest indigenous population. I did most of my research was on El Salvador. What happened in El Salvador is not technically a genocide, but we would call that a mass atrocity, right? Or as Harif and Gura would say, politicide, killing for political reasons, right? Which is not technically in the Genocide Convention, right? And so I remember the reason I became interested in El Salvador. I read a book by Mark Danner called The Massacre at El Mazaki. Mark Danner was a New York Times reporter. And I just remember going to the bookstore, seeing this cover, and this cover drew me in. It was a cornfield, and Death was standing there, a hooded cloak, with a sickle, and you see a woman holding her baby. I said, what is this about? So I read the book, and that book, I would say, changed my life forever because because of that book, I traveled down to El Salvador. Okay, so I remember after reading the book, right, so I went there in 2001 to El Salvador, and I remember I said, in El Mazate, to give a little more context, about 1,000 men, women, and children were murdered there by government forces. They were murdered by a battalion called the Ataco Battalion. And this battalion was trained in the United States, trained in Florida. Okay, so there were a lot of Salvadorians being trained, and from Honduras, and of course the Contras a little bit later on. They're being trained on U.S. military bases. Okay, the obvious one is the SOA, School of the Americas, which has changed its name to a more like because they used to call it the School of Assassins. So now they changed its name to the Western Hemisphere, something where they security studies. Yeah, it's something more like a more complicated name than that. So this is, and in that village, like it was just El Mazati was just a microcosm of the Cold War politics that was going on at the same time. In the early 80s, Central America, it was a very tumultuous time. I mean, just imagine, like, the genocide is going on in Guatemala, okay, led by Reyes Mon. In the early 80s, the military of El Salvador is doing these operations they call hammer and anvil operations. Basically, sweeps in the countryside, right? And in certain villages, like Omozate, they killed everyone there. But just because this area was affiliated with the FMLN guerrillas, okay, the insurgency in Guatemala. And this insurgency did have communist affiliations, okay, but El Mazati was a little different because the people of this village were pacifists. They were evangelical Christians. And they never took up arms during the struggle. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, just like someone being targeted for their ethnicity, the individuals Almozate did not have a choice, okay? They were killed for political reasons, yes, but they were there and they couldn't escape. They couldn't escape what was to come. Okay, so, as I said, the victims were pacifists. The perpetrators were the Attico Battalion. This battalion was trained and created in the US, as I said, and Colonel Monterroso was the person that was leading this battalion. He was a star in US circles, right? He was a very respected person because they liked the way he got things done. They said, okay, you want a job? Send Monterroso, send his men in there. And there's a picture of him, famous picture. He's hugging the US ambassador at the time, Dean Hinton, right? They're hugging, they're giving each other a nice embrace. And so, to Dean Hinton's credit, even though, I mean, right now that picture, considering what Monterroso did, considering what the Atacado Battalion did in Almozate, Dean Hinton ended up getting fired from his position as ambassador for criticizing. He came around, so he started criticizing the Reagan administration policy in El Salvador. But this was like maybe a year or two later. So what happened? Okay, so Monterroso, for his part, he was also killed because he thought he had captured a rebel radio. He took the radio on his helicopter, but the radio was a bomb. So Monterroso did not survive long after the massacre at Almozate. If you walk to Almozate, I did this in 2001, there's a small memorial with like a family holding hands. There's some names. But still, in 2001, I'm not sure how it is now, that's 17 years ago. But this was from 1981. You can still see the M16 casings in the ground. I mean, it looks like still a fresh massacre zone, right? You can see the M16 casings. The children were selling them to tourists. They would pick them up on the ground. Some places you can find bone fragments because all the bodies were not identified. There was one Argentinian forensic scientist that would come there every summer. She would work by herself to help identify the victim. Many of the victims were children. So she would be working by herself, actually excavating mass graves. You just see her. I saw her one day, we were just walking there, she was just working, taking the bones out, trying to put the bone fragments together. To see, okay, this is a child, this is a man, this is a woman. And what happened in this particular incident, the men were immediately killed. The women were taken to part of the forest, raped, then murdered. The children were housed in a couple like small houses, small structures. And since the government didn't know what to do with them, they ended up killing them. They were crying for their mothers and fathers, so they ended up killing the children also. A couple were, if they were young enough, were kidnapped by the military and put in adoption agencies. So some of them, there was actually a couple of very interesting stories about people from that area that grew up in the United States, Canada, or Australia, and so they never even knew that their family was killed during these massacres. Okay, they always thought that, they were just, they didn't know the background, their familiar background. And at the same time, I just remember going there in 2001. There was a very kind man named Samuel. He was the person that was in the adjacent village to Almozate, and his testimony was very heartbreaking. He would say that maybe, he said, when the military came in December of 1981, Samuel said that he just they could hear the screams. They could hear the soldiers shooting. They could hear the screams, but he said he was too afraid to go near it. He said, I just stayed where I was, we were just huddled, we were hiding, hoping that the military wouldn't come to us. And so he said 2 days later, him alone, he said, I walked by myself. I just had to see what went on. And then he saw the tragedy of the massacre, right? He saw the bodies, he said the animals were devouring the corpses. So he said that it was, of course, a very horrific scene. Samuel was also victimized after what happened in El Mazaki, where they killed his father in front of him. They shot his father, the military forces, and they said they buried him on the side of the road. So he said he had to wait till weeks after the military left, dig up the remains of his father, and take him for a proper burial. So just imagine, these are the things that were occurring in El Salvador in the early 80s, okay? Okay, but the Atacado Battalion, the one responsible for El Mazaki, was also responsible for other atrocities. I'm not sure if you ever heard of the story of the UCA, the university in San Salvador, where Jesuit priests who were instructing at the university were murdered on the university grounds. 5 Jesuit priests and their housekeepers. And what they did was, this was toward the end of the war, and since these Jesuit priests had a lot of influence in El Salvador, that was like the last target of the war. They said, okay, this war is going to be a stalemate, this war is going to end, but we're going to kill these people because they're the ones that, in the mind of the government, they're the ones that started, or not started the war, but gave the ideas to the people. Okay, so they went into the university, killed the priests, smeared their brains on the wall, and said, this is what you get, written in blood, when you think in El Salvador. So, and another famous figure, priest, bishop, who has recently been canonized by the church, Archbishop Romero, was killed giving mass in March of 1980. Now, Romero was, when he first came to El Salvador, he was very conservative. And that's why the church sent him, because they said, okay, we don't want a rebel rouser there. We don't want someone causing problems. But when he saw the things going on, he changed his tune. He became very, as a defender of the people. And he was the first bishop, killed in a church since Thomas Becket in the year 1170. So that was a very historic moment, okay? That atrocity. And still, Romero is like such an important figure to Salvadoran society. There's not only to the Catholics, but there's a rising evangelical Christian population in El Salvador, and Romero is also revered by that part of society, demonized by the part of society, the very conservative part of El Salvador society. But as for the general population, he is a hero. In fact, if you go to where he's buried, there's lines and lines of people always waiting to see him. Okay. Okay, so El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, what did they have in common? Okay, well, it was during the Cold War. Cold War, proxy wars, okay? You had, on one side, the United States supporting one group. You had the Russians, or the Soviet Union at the time, I'm sorry, and the Cubans supporting the other group. Now, since Central America was very close to the United States and very far from the Soviet Union, it was very hard to find very direct Soviet influence. You know, maybe a few officers here and there, but there was definitely Cuban intervention, because I talked to a lot of the ex-guerrilla fighters, and they said they were trained in Cuba, or Cuban soldiers were fighting with them, alongside them in El Salvador. But in all these wars, you have millions and millions of dollars being sent down by the United States. You had, in some cases, soldiers. In El Salvador, there were soldiers sent down. Over the course of a 12-year civil war, probably around between 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers served in El Salvador. You had pilots, some cases even mercenaries. Okay, this is before Blackwater, this is before military contractors, right? So you had also, of course, the CIA. Other organizations that worked with Black Ops were down there. Organizations like, what was it called? The activity of ISA, Intelligence Support Agency. So you had a lot of like moving parts in El Salvador, right? So this was as I said, a proxy war, right? But the majority of the people, for example, that died in El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, were civilians. They were not soldiers, right? I remember Franklin Littell once told me, Dr. Franklin Littell said, you know, in modern warfare, if you want to be safe, put on a uniform. Because if you're in a uniform, you're safer than being a civilian in a conflict zone. And Central America really backs this statement. In Salvador and Honduras, you had active death squads operating. Death squads were nothing more than paramilitary groups, ex-military or ex-police that would compile lists of people and execute these people when they're off duty or working. Usually, a lot of these like organizations, it was very hard. I was looking, when I was in El Salvador, I was looking to find ex-death squad members, but it's very difficult to do that because they don't, you know, it's, they were very, even within the organizations themselves, they were very secretive. So they said that, you know, people in the same military didn't know that other people were operating as death squad members. Okay, so they were very clandestine even within their military or police. And in Honduras, there was a death squad called Battalion 316, and they performed a lot of atrocities on a smaller level. And also in Nicaragua was a little different. There was mass atrocity, but it actually kind of unfolded into a civil war between the Contras and the Sandinistas. So in Nicaragua, between 30,000 and 60,000 people were killed in that conflict. In El Salvador, about 80,000 people were killed. That's 1 out of every 45 Salvadoranians, more or less. And in the end, these atrocities are still with the society, right? These atrocities continue to plague Central America. I mean, it's not like the war's over, there's reconciliation, everything is fine. So you look at problems like the Maras, look at immigration, right? These countries are basket cases. I spent a lot of time, like, you know, just wandering around El Salvador, like going through Honduras, right? Just seeing, like, people there. I mean, I've talked to people that say, our society is so bad, there's so much violence, right? And this violence is a carryover from the war. They said, I talked to a girl, she said, I've been deported 3 times trying to cross in the United States. My friend promised me a job where I would work 16 hours working as a dishwasher. But it's better that than living in El Salvador. So you can see, like, you know, I mean, how terrible the society is. So when you see the caravan of migrants, as we like to see in the news, people coming over, like, you know, and everyone feels, you know, not everyone, of course, but a small segment of society feels very threatened by this, right? Like, you know, these aren't gang members, these are desperate people trying to escape the gangs. And, I mean, unless you go there, it's hard to like, for me to put a picture in your head of what it's like, but that's with any conflict zone or ex-conflict zone, right? Because just being there, talking to the people, and I just remember that one day a friend down there invited me, said, oh, why don't you come over to my house, okay? Why don't we have a beer or something? I said, yeah, sure. I followed him through to his house, and there was two guys just sitting there on the curb, two Maras. And he said, wait, let me check with these guys to make sure it's okay that you come in. I said, yeah, sure, no problem. So he checked with them, everything was fine, but I mean, the people are living under constant threat, okay? There's economic threat. There's no jobs. There's the threat of violence, okay? And it just angers me when I see some of the rhetoric coming out of Washington, especially now, about these people. They say, oh, they're this and that. The U.S. helped, not alone. U.S. wasn't alone in this, right? I'm not on attacking U.S. politics, right? The U.S. helped, though, destabilize these countries, right? The U.S. helped by funneling so much money during the Cold War, and what happened when the Cold War ended? They abandoned these countries. They abandoned them, okay? Cold War's over, okay, good luck, that's it. And I just thinking back, and Mexico now, I just want to check the time. Mexico is where I am. I have been the last 9 years. I would like to mention a little bit. I know the talk is on Central America, but there is mass atrocity happening in Mexico, okay? I've been there for the last 9 years. They keep on uncovering mass graves. Nobody wants to talk about it. They say it's okay, the drug cartels, the government, okay, but nobody knows the full story. In areas where my wife is from, it's just a no-go area, right? So I'm not sure if you guys have heard when they murdered the students in 2014, right? The 43 students. So they're looking for 43 students were murdered, right? With government involvement. There was a big outcry for social justice, and they said, okay, let's find the students, right? So they're digging up the students, looking for the students, and they find a mass grave. Oh, that's not the students, so they just cover up the graves. Okay, so they're finding bodies all over Guerrero, all over parts of Mexico, looking for the students. So, oh, we didn't find the students, but we found 200 people in a mass grave. So it's like, okay, but who are these people, right? So I think that it's a shame that violence has become so endemic in parts of Mexico. Not all of them, because parts of it are very actually peaceful. Parts of Mexico, it's really bad. Central America, especially in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and that's, in this moment is like has a very very bad political problem. But before that political problem, Nicaragua was relatively peaceful, right? But a lot of these places that are some of the most violent countries in the world were affected by what happened during the Cold War, what happened in the 1980s especially, and affected by mass atrocity. So I just want you to think, like when you see the news and you see the there's one perspective, another perspective, like I would like you just to think with empathy about what these people have gone through, okay, in their lives, the journey of these people, and how much they've really suffered, because Central America has, in the whole history of Central America, has never had a good time. It has never had a time of, this is a prosperous time, this is a good time to be living in Central America. It's just been one atrocity, one repression after another. And that's why I thought it was important today to speak to you about just, I mean, of course there's not enough time, but just about my experience in Central America, the genocide and atrocities that have happened, and just to introduce you to a window, just a little window, right? Into like, what was going on there, is going on there, and about the very bleak future that the people down there have. Okay, so I'll open up to questions because I know we have, I would, like to have a very informal discussion if you'd like. And so that's it.
That's all, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, I like that.
Sure, go ahead.
Do you feel that maybe the United States has had a very significant hand in like destabilization as far as like Latin America is concerned,
Oh.
obviously for our own benefit?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. It's not just in Central America and South America, but
Absolutely.
Central America is very obvious, just because like the social, economic, and the violence going on in there. It's a very obvious. It's very like glaring. It's very glaring.
So isn't it hypocritical of us to actually call all of these people rapists and
Absolutely. Even before that, it's hypocritical.
Yeah.
So even before, like, not knowing that, it's very bad to call someone a rapist, a murderer, without even knowing who that person is. But yes, of course, the politics are very hypocritical. In fact, I always thought that the way to solve the migration problem is to help these countries become stronger, right? Not act as destabilizing forces, but to help the countries become stronger. You know how much money that would save on immigration and this and that? No one wants to leave their homes, right? I mean, my wife and I were in Mexico. We found a train station where they have the train La Bestia. La Bestia is a train where migrants cross over from Central America to the United States. And we saw a bunch of guys like lying on the tracks waiting for they didn't know when the train was going to leave. So they're like, and they asked us, hey, how you doing? They were from Honduras. Said, where are we? And we'd explain where they were on the map. And they're like, we're hungry. Do you have any food? So my wife and I went to a store and brought them some food. Some stuff that wouldn't be like perishable, right? Because they had another like maybe 4 or 5 days on the train. So, I mean, nobody wants to suffer through that hardship. I mean, it's like the way the politicians make it out is that everyone wants to come here. Everyone wants to leave their families. No, it's a very unnatural thing to do. Leave your family to come to a place where you don't even speak the language. So, yeah, I think it's very hypocritical. Yes?
Do you see a lot of parallels in Central and maybe just Latin America in total as with the Middle East? Because we see a lot of these patterns also happening in the Middle East from policies that were implemented during the Cold War as well.
Well, I mean, I know that Dick Cheney, during one of his vice presidential debates, mentioned that in Iraq we're going to use the Salvadorian option, right? He wasn't clear, right? He said that we brought democracy to El Salvador and we can do the same in Iraq. And I know that Colonel Steele, who was also operating in El Salvador, he was operating with the U.S. forces in Iraq, okay? And I think that, and something really chilling was when Cheney mentions the Salvadorian option, and you have reports of Shia death squads operating in Iraq, right? So this was part of a counterinsurgency plan. So I think there are parallels for sure. Yeah, I mean, probably if I think back, if I investigate it further, you probably even find more, because it's like some of the policies do repeat themselves. When I was looking at the U.S. intervention in El Salvador, when I was trying to investigate it, a lot of the things that involved military tactics by the U.S. was redacted. So helicopter operations, whatever. So you say, oh, this is going to be great information. 100 pages of black lines, right? Yes. Anyone? Yes, sure.
So the U.S. is always kind of like, it seems like the U.S. has always kind of had like a narcissistic view of itself, like, oh, we're perfect, everyone wants to come here, everyone wants to be us, all that. It's like, do you think personally yourself, like with how we pretty much have a president right now that's embodying that kind of narcissistic ideal, people are really seeing it more, and do you think that's ever going to change personally yourself? Like, do you think changing times, is it going to change?
My hope is that, I don't know, maybe it's a naive hope, but maybe many people are waking up, seeing what's going on, and maybe the reaction to this president will open a lot of people's eyes. So I'm not sure. I think that many of us, and I say us because I'm from the U.S., my wife is from Mexico, grew up with kind of like a privilege, like an experience of privilege. You know, we're from the U.S., this and that. You know, we're, you know, and there are some parts of history, right, where it shows that the U.S. acted nobly and honorably, right? But toward Latin America, that never was the case. That never was the case, right? So we have to, I mean, everything from the U.S., from Manifest Destiny, right, to the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. has never acted honorably towards Latin America. A great book by William Leo Grand is called Our Own Backyard. Talks about how the U.S. has treated Central America in particular as literally its own backyard. So, oh, we can do it. It's part of our property. So it doesn't really matter, right? These are yeah, sovereign nations, but at the same time, they're just nations like, you know, this part of the it's the Americas, extension of the U.S.
Yeah, it very much seems like the U.S. only acts nobly to the people that they have to, and they very much try and get away with anything else they can with people that, you know, they consider, oh well, it doesn't matter, who cares about them? But like other countries that the U.S. cares about themselves, they try and put out like this good front of like, oh look at us, we're gonna help you, and then it's behind the scenes the rest of them.
I mean, I think that, like, you know, history is very complicated. And I think that, for example, I mean, we can look back in, for example, the European history, right? Like how colonialism and slavery were justified, right? You know, so I think that whenever you have a power, right, a power that, like a world power or a power that's dominant, then these tendencies happen to happen, like with exploitation, and I think that the U.S. policy toward Latin America has that kind of relationship still.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Yeah, so obviously sort of you paint a fairly bleak picture. Right? And the United States' role is an important factor in all of this, but as you mentioned, a lot of this instability goes back to sort of the social and political inequalities in those countries that even predates
Absolutely.
the United States. I mean, you know, and I think the cynical person in the United States could, you know, look at this, just blanket look at Central America and say, oh, it's just such a mess. These are age-old problems that we can't fix. And so it's really their problem, even if we have some responsibility for it. So what is you know, the approach in sort of these post-atrocity or perpetual atrocity, in some cases, regions in Central America in particular?
Well, I think that, like, you know, it's a good point, because let's look at like Latin America as a whole. Like Central America you know, was always, you know, even from Spanish colonial rule, was extremely corrupt, right? So is a pandemic a corruption? Like if you're in Mexico, for example, I mean, it's a good chance that, you know, the police will stop you, right, for something, some false violation, right? Then you have to, like, you know, pay them money, right? So it's endemic corruption. Now, but I would argue that these places weren't always violent places. That's what I would say, and that violence in these places is relatively new. I mean, there were violence, of course. The violence goes, I mean, but not violence on this level. Not the amount of weapons that were funneled into these countries, right? So these countries have, like, you know, all these weapons were funneled in. They never left the country, right? The Maras, for example, they started in Los Angeles. They were deported from Los Angeles to El Salvador. And I would say, yes, like, even without US intervention, Cuban intervention, Soviet intervention, that these countries probably wouldn't be in the best shape. But I think that what's happened during the Cold War has really compounded things, right? And I think that the atrocities that happened has traumatized the country so badly, and also that there seems to be, if you have an injury, when you talk with the people, you know, you can see you're talking to people that were Trump. This is like in the 1980s, so let me see, how many years ago is that? Like, you know, 30 years ago. Yeah, 30, 35 years ago. And so when these wars happened, you had a lot of the, like in many genocides and atrocities, a lot of the greatest minds were targeted. So a lot of the smartest people in society were killed. Like a lot of the intelligentsia, the intelligent, the people that were like, you know, had plans, like the Jesuit priests, for example, right? So they said it was incredible what the Jesuit priests were working on, but the government not only killed the priests, but they burned all their files. Anything they were working on, they burned it down. They had all the papers, they burned it, right? So that history is forever lost. So I think that influx of arms, some of the brightest minds leaving these countries, not just being killed, but also fleeing from war, right? So if you're in El Salvador or Honduras, Nicaragua, and you had a little bit of money, a little bit of education, you'd be like, okay, I'm out of here. I'm gonna maybe go to the US, I'm gonna go to a different place because I don't wanna be part of the war that's happening. So I think that has left like a black mark on these countries. And I, you know, I mean, it's hard to make these kind of like estimations or like what would have happened if this didn't happen or what would have, but I think that that I'm not saying that for example the U.S. was responsible for all the bad things that happened in Latin America, because that's another part of the argument, right? So I used to argue with people at the university, and they'll be like, oh, it's all the U.S.'s fault, all the U.S. faults, but every single problem is the U.S. fault, right? So like, oh, you know, I don't know, my soda isn't cold enough. Oh, it's the U.S.'s fault. So everything was like, you know, blaming the U.S. for everything. Oh, there's corruption. That's the U.S.'s fault. So I mean, there's the other, you know, argument that they take it too far. But I believe that there are things that we look at these types of atrocities, the trauma on society, and just how these societies, not just the infrastructure was destroyed, the introduction of arms, and all the brain power that was just taken out of these countries. So I think that has a direct correlation on what's going on with these countries at this moment, because the same problems that are happening in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are not happening in Costa Rica, where there wasn't a war. So. Oh, sorry, is there a question?
That's what I was going to ask you about Costa Rica.
Yeah, because
they never had a civil war
or even Panama, right? But Panama is a different case because it was because of the Panama Canal. There's a lot of influx of money, and so in Panama. So
great. I think that we'll take that as the last question and comment.
Sure.
If you don't mind, because
sure. We want to get to the. You know.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Holmes once again for coming and
yes.
talking to us. So, thank you.